The police lights hit the street before anyone asked a question. One moment, he was standing in front of his own home. The next, neighbors were staring, phones raised, as if he had already done something wrong. All because he said one sentence they didn't expect him to say. I'm not under your HOA. In a neighborhood built on rules, silence, and quiet obedience, that refusal was treated like a threat. But what they assumed about him, and why they felt so comfortable calling the cops, revealed something far uglier than a mailbox dispute. And what they didn't know about the land beneath their feet would change everything. Before that morning, Ethan Carter's life was quiet in the way he liked it. 36 years old, an engineer by habit and by mindset, he believed in systems, boundaries, and things that made sense when you looked closely enough. He had bought the house at the edge of Oakrest Meadows because it offered exactly that: space, silence, and distance from other people's expectations. He worked long hours, came home early, fixed things with his hands, and kept to himself. No drama, no need for attention. Oakrest Meadows looked perfect on the surface. Lawns cut to identical lengths. Mailboxes aligned like they were measured with a ruler. Smiles that appeared on cue and vanished just as quickly. It was a kind of place where order mattered more than people, where fitting in quietly was the unspoken rule. Ethan noticed it immediately, but he didn't think much of it. He wasn't there to belong. He was there to live. Still, the looks lingered. The way neighbors paused when he walked by. The way questions followed him that were never asked out loud. He didn't look like the people who usually live there, and in Oakrest, difference was treated like disruption. It wasn't open hostility. It was something colder. Assumptions wrapped in politeness. Authority enforced with confidence. The notes came early. Friendly reminders. Then warnings. Then official notices that assumed obedience without permission. Ethan stayed calm because he knew something they didn't. His home sat just beyond the line they believed controlled everything. A boundary printed faintly on a map most people never bothered to read. But in a neighborhood where power was enforced by perception, facts didn't matter yet. And the moment he refused to play along, the tension stopped being quiet and became dangerous. The shift from irritation to intimidation happened quickly. What began as notes and emails turned into something heavier, something that sat in Ethan's chest every time he stepped outside. The warning stopped sounding procedural and started sounding personal. Envelopes appeared on his door before sunrise. Photos were taken from across the street. Screenshots of his home circulated in the neighborhood forum, framed as a problem that needed to be dealt with. The language was careful, but the message underneath was clear. He didn't belong, and someone needed to put him back in his place. Neighbors who once nodded now watched from behind curtains. Lawnmowers shut off when he walked by. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. It wasn't loud hatred. It was quieter than that, the kind that hides behind rules and smiles while tightening the rope slowly. Ethan felt it every morning when he stepped onto his porch and saw unfamiliar cars idling just a little too long. The fines escalated fast. Numbers stacked up, accompanied by threats that hinted at liens, enforcement, and consequences. None of it was legal, and he knew that, but legality didn't stop fear from creeping in. Because this wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about how easily authority was being weaponized against him. How quickly suspicion replaced common sense. How comfortable people were watching it happen. Then came the emails referencing police involvement, not as a last resort, but as leverage, as a reminder of who held power in this neighborhood. Ethan understood what that meant without anyone needing to explain it. He knew how situations like this played out when assumptions were made about a man standing alone against an organized group, especially a man who didn't look like them. The day the patrol car turned onto the street, everything slowed down. Red and blue lights reflected off perfect driveways. Phones came out. Whispers traveled faster than the cruiser itself. To the onlookers, it looked like order being restored. To Ethan, it felt like a line had been crossed. He stood there calmly, documents in hand, while eyes scanned him as if they were searching for guilt. Authority demanded compliance before understanding. The accusation came before the facts. The assumption came before the truth. And for a moment, it didn't matter that he was right. What mattered was perception. A man standing alone, being framed as a problem, while a group stood behind the story that suited them. But Ethan had prepared for this. Every threat, every fine, every overstep had been documented. He had maps, certified records, stamp proof that the power being used against him wasn't real. What shocked him wasn't that the HOA ignored it. It was how confident they were doing so. As if repetition could replace legality. As if saying something enough times made it true. As the tension built, something else surfaced. Cracks in their authority. Expired filings. Boundaries never approved. Land that had quietly slipped through bureaucratic gaps. The deeper Ethan looked, the more fragile their control became. What they enforced daily with confidence was built on neglect and assumption. And still, they pushed harder. Public hearings were announced. Neighbors were encouraged to watch. The spectacle mattered more than the outcome. It was never about resolution. It was about submission, making an example, reminding everyone what happens when someone refuses to fall in line. Ethan felt the weight of it all pressing down at once. Not fear exactly, something sharper. A realization that this wasn't just his fight anymore, that what was happening to him had been happening quietly to others for years, just without resistance. He wasn't the first target. He was just the first one to stop and read the fine print. The closer the confrontation came, the more the neighborhood held its breath, because the next moment wouldn't just decide whether Ethan won or lost. It would decide whether truth mattered more than control. And when the crowd finally gathered and authority stood face to face with proof, no one was prepared for how completely the balance was about to shatter. The moment everything broke open came under full daylight, with witnesses everywhere. The patrol car idled at the curb, engine humming like a warning. Neighbors stood frozen in clusters, phones raised, recording without speaking. Authority had arrived, and with it came that familiar shift in the air, the quiet assumption that someone like Ethan must have done something wrong. He felt it in the way eyes followed his hands, in the way no one asked him a single question before deciding where he stood. The officer listened first to the HOA. Their voices were confident, rehearsed, layered with words like standards, compliance, and order. They spoke as if the story was already settled, as if Ethan was just another problem to be corrected. Every sentence placed him further outside the circle of belonging. A man who didn't fit. A man who wouldn't obey. A man they felt safe escalating against. Then Ethan stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply held out the truth. Certified maps. County seals. Boundaries drawn in ink instead of assumption. Proof that everything happening to him, the fines, the threats, the public shaming, the police call, was built on nothing. The officer studied the documents while the crowd held its breath. Seconds stretched long enough to feel dangerous. When the officer finally looked up, the shift was immediate. The confidence drained from the HOA's faces. The posture control collapsed into confusion. The authority they had worn so comfortably suddenly had nowhere to stand, because the law didn't agree with them. And for the first time, neither did reality. What made the moment heavy wasn't just that Ethan was right. It was how close this had come to going very wrong. How easily a misunderstanding, fueled by bias and entitlement, could have ended with handcuffs instead of clarity. How quickly rules had been used as camouflage for something older and uglier. The crowd felt it too. You could see in the way phones lowered, in the way people avoided each other's eyes. The officer made it clear. This wasn't a crime. This wasn't enforcement. This was harassment dressed up as authority. And suddenly, the people who had felt powerful minutes earlier were being told to step back, to stop, to explain themselves. Silence spread across the street like a wave. The same neighbors who had watched quietly now realized they had been complicit in something dangerous. That perfection had come at a cost, that someone had almost paid it. Ethan stood there, steady but changed, not relieved, awake, because even in victory, the truth hurt. He hadn't imagined the danger. He had lived inside it. And as the patrol car finally pulled away, leaving behind a shaken neighborhood and a shattered illusion of control, one question lingered in the air. If the truth hadn't been written down, would anyone have believed him at all? When the street finally emptied and the noise faded, Ethan stood alone in front of his house, the same place where everything had started. The mailbox was still there, unchanged. The house was still quiet. But he wasn't the same person who had walked out that morning. What stayed with him wasn't relief. It was a weight of how close everything had come going wrong, how fragile safety can be when authority decides who deserves it. The HOA backed off quickly after that day. The fine stopped. The emails disappeared. The public confidence they once carried dissolved into silence and legal caution. Neighbors who had watched from a distance now waved, some with embarrassment, others with gratitude. A few even apologized. But the damage had already been done, not to his property, to his sense of trust. Because once you see how easily power can turn against you, you never fully unsee it. Ethan didn't walk away feeling victorious. He walked away aware that the only reason he wasn't arrested, fined into submission, or worse, was because he had paperwork, time, and the ability to prove his innocence on demand. He knew too many people didn't get that chance. Too many are judged before they're heard. Too many are punished for simply existing in spaces that were never meant to question themselves. This wasn't just about an HOA or a mailbox. It was about how racism often hides behind systems, policies, and rules, pretending to be neutral while targeting the same people over and over again. It was about how suspicion replaces humanity the moment someone doesn't fit the expected image of belonging, and how quickly neighbors become spectators instead of protectors. Ethan kept his home. He kept his ground. But what he gained was something heavier than justice. He gained clarity, the kind that comes from surviving a moment that could have ended differently if the truth hadn't been written down somewhere official. This story isn't rare. It's familiar. It just doesn't always end this way. So the question isn't whether racism still exists in quiet neighborhoods and polished systems. The question is this: if the roles were reversed, if the proof didn't exist, if the cameras weren't out, would the truth still have mattered?